Good evening and welcome to the Grand Lodge webinar series. This evening we will be talking about Freemasonry and the Roman Catholic Church. As we've talked about in previous sessions, these are not tiled, so please govern yourselves accordingly. The recording was started. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. If you do need to unmute, you can use the spacebar to do it temporarily. Send any questions you have during the session to the host via the chat, and we will be sure to cover them at the end. We do have a poll that we open up here at about 5 minutes or so before the end, and all of these videos will be posted on the Grand Lodge YouTube channel. I try to get those released by Saturday morning. So this is a part one, and so next week is part two, and then the next one after that is Light and Darkness. This one is of note because it will not be recorded due to some of the content that's there. It will be only presented via the Zoom and not recorded. And then we'll jump into some sessions with our youth organizations, DeMolay, Job's Daughters, and then they're going to do a panel discussion part as well.
Neat.
The upcoming the show and tell challenge is still open. It asks you to submit an answer to one of the three questions here. What is Freemasonry? What in your life and legacy say about Freemasonry, and how will you help others find their way to rewards in the craft? As we've talked about before, if you have a topic that you would like to present at one of these webinars, please contact the mentoring committee and we will get you on the schedule. And without any further ado, most worshipful, I'm going to stop screen share and it is all yours.
Alrighty, well, I will start screen share. Share. There we go. I'm assuming you're seeing that.
Yes.
Alrighty. Play from start. There we go. Alrighty. Before I get too far into this, first off, thank you everyone for showing up tonight. I'll try to make this as interesting as possible for you. I find it to be a fascinating subject, and it involves some really interesting things. It also involves a lot of things. So I've tried to pare this down into something I can do in two chunks. For those of you who want to see the original presentation in prose form, I put a link in the chat room box, and that link goes to a Dropbox folder where you will find the PowerPoint, and you'll find the prose version, which is the long version of the presentation, and a couple other little items that I think you'll find interesting. So feel free to download that. I'll leave it up there for quite some time. So that way you can not listen to this, I guess. You could just, go read that. All right. In any event, thank you again for coming tonight. This is about what I call a study in differences, because I think we're all aware of the fact that there's this issue between the Catholic Church and Freemasonry, and it's not necessarily just one way. Sometimes it's two ways. And this has been going on practically since the beginning of Freemasonry. And that's the part that's kind of weird, is that it would continue to go on so long. It's a source of misunderstanding for a lot of Freemasons. I've heard some things said that were not correct, which we all do, but they were not correct in a way that really was making the problem worse. And so I started looking into this, and I want to be able to, what I wanted to be able to do is appreciate why do they feel this way about it? What is really the point? And also to look at the context of what was happening, because there's a much wider world of Masonry and history of Masonry out there than what we have, of course, in the United States. And we're quite a bit different than most of the rest of the places as well, most of the rest of the world as well, and how we do Freemasonry. So that caused me to look into this. When I first did this presentation, or first cooked up this presentation, it was about 8 hours long, because there's an amazing amount of material that goes into this. And there's all these little side trips you have to take into history and the politics of the 19th century and so on, in order to understand why the Roman Church and Freemasonry may have been having issues. However, no one wants to sit still for that long, and I don't blame them. So I managed to get it down to a couple of hour-long or less presentations, depending on how fast I can talk on any given night. And so we're going to jump into this. Here's the 5 questions I wanted to answer with this presentation. Why is there a conflict? Is it just plain theological? Is it political? Is it power? Is it wealth? Is it all of that? Is it something that I hadn't even thought of? And so I thought what I have to do is go back to the original documents and go back to the original time when this first started and take a look at those documents, see what was going on in the world at that time, and try and figure out why this was a problem. Generally, I don't like to particularly read slides word for word, but I'm going to this one because we're recording this and I think this is very important. This is my disclaimer. The purpose of this presentation is not to denigrate, criticize, condemn, or attack either the Roman Catholic Church or Freemasonry. The purpose of this presentation is not to absolve the Roman Catholic Church and or Freemasonry of any mistakes made in their name in the past, but to simply offer the historical facts. And believe me, there's problems on both sides. Freemasonry is not 100% clean in this issue. It is important to recognize that American Freemasonry is somewhat different than the practice of Freemasonry on the European continent, particularly in the early days of Freemasonry. Each person who attends this presentation is fully free to accept or reject any of the information contained within and is encouraged to do their own research and come to their own conclusions. I could be wrong. It's happened before. On the long version of it, if you download it, I've tried to put as many of the sources that I used as possible that I could remember when I did it. So you can go see where I got my information from. Okay, so the first thing I had to do, because I'm not Catholic myself, I wasn't raised Catholic, I had to go find out what is the foundation of the church. Now, in the upper right-hand corner, by the way, this is the symbol of the papacy. And if you're into symbolism, like many Masons are, you've got to look into this. There's a lot going on in that particular logo, and it's really pretty interesting. So just kind of a little aside. So Roman Catholic Church, where does it get the idea that it is a church, or how did it start? Well, they essentially started, whoops, I skipped a slide. There we go. They essentially started with the thing in Matthew about upon this rock, I will build my church. And so they teach that essentially Jesus tapped Peter, Peter tapped the next guy, that guy tapped the next guy, and that there's this long unbroken chain of successors to St. Peter who got the power to create the church from Jesus. And so that's the beginning of the power and the authority of this particular organization. Another fundamental thing that they like to put in with this is that the church itself, its doctrine on faith and morals is infallible. Now, this is really going to be really important as we get into some of this other stuff, because it gets to the whole issue of how do you treat other people? How do you see the world? What do you think your mission is in the world? So that's where they started. Then they went on to what's generally called the Great Commission, Matthew 28, to create a church. And I grabbed this little quote from Pope Pius XI. By the way, if you want to do research on this sort of thing, the Vatican's website is magnificent. It is just really well done. And there's tons of stuff on there you can read and find out about historically. It's really quite a resource. In any event, Pope Pius XI, essentially what he's saying here, if you read this quote, is that it's us or no one. We are the supreme authority, and because we're from Peter and his legitimate successors, right? Lactantius was a Christian that advised Constantine during his reign and eventual conversion to Christianity on how to deal with Christians and what kinds of things Christianity is about. And of course, at the time, we only had the Catholic Church. And he made this statement about it's alone in keeping the true worship. And if you're not part of this church, then there's no hope for you of salvation or of life. This is pretty bold stuff, and that's a pretty black and white concept of where you're coming from. So the Roman Catholic Church essentially is saying we're the one true church. Everything we do is infallible. Now, interestingly, the Pope was not infallible until the late 1800s. And that there's a whole interesting history that goes behind that. That's why there used to be 8 hours long. But there's this whole interesting history that goes with why the Pope didn't become officially infallible until that time. In any event, it has to do with truth with a capital T, the truth of life, the truth of faith, however you want to put that. They hold that truth, and no one else's idea or interpretation of that truth is correct except what comes from the church. And it's the duty of the church to regulate lives of men. By men we mean society, men and women, in order to bring them to salvation. So salvation, reconciliation with God, is only possible through this particular organization. Now, tonight we want to look at this. However you might feel about that, I want you to just try and put the emotions and your own personal feelings aside. Let's be scientists and look at this and say, okay, let's appreciate that that's their starting point and that's their belief, and see how that's going to play out with these other things. So we're not judging at this point. In fact, we shouldn't judge at any point. We just want to say, okay, we understand that part of it. Let's move forward and take a look at what history shows us. Well, what history shows us is when Freemasonry left the British Isles and started in on the continent, it wasn't always that well accepted, because a lot of what Freemasonry stands for makes anyone that's a king, prince, potentate, whatever, a little nervous. Although eventually much of royalty got involved in it, as they did in England, initially there was some real problems. We don't really know when the first Italian lodges existed, but we do know there was what was called, and this was the name of the lodge, the Jacobite Lodge at Rome. It existed for several years. They were obviously Jacobites, outlaws from Scotland, and they claimed to be under under the Grand Lodge of Scotland, which the Grand Lodge of Scotland doesn't really say yes or no. They just kind of look the other way when you ask that question. Because these guys were not necessarily chartered, but they did have a lodge. They closed the lodge, however, in 1738 when the first papal bull condemning Freemasonry came out. So let's think about that. Taking 1717 or even 1723, which is probably more accurate, as the true start of Grand Lodge Freemasonry, it wasn't too many years before we caught the attention of the church and they had to put out official things condemning us. And that's pretty quick. For any organization. So, you got to keep that in mind, that this started almost immediately when we became more organized and became more public, so to speak, about what we were doing. In our library and museum in Nebraska here, we actually have a copy of a book that was printed in the 1800s. That's the history and the minutes of the Jacobite Lodge at Rome. And the minutes are of the last meeting they had before they shut the lodge, because the papal bull had come out, and it's fascinating to read. Okay, so oceans of ink, forests of trees have been killed writing things about Freemasonry by the church. So these aren't the only documents. These are the 6 probably most important documents. In the long version, I go through each one and show you how things built. Here, what we're going to do is just look at a couple of them briefly so that we can continue on. But the thing to know is, when it started in 1738, and this first one was a bull, so we had 4 bulls and 2 encyclicals, and I'll explain that in a second. When it started, it was kind of, Freemasonry is a bad idea. We wish you wouldn't do this. Please don't. It wasn't quite so nasty. But as time went on, as we moved forward from the 1700s into the 1800s up to 1846, which is the one we're most worried about because it was the last one that was written, it goes from being kind of calm to getting more and more and more, I want to say, paranoid. We became more of a conspiracy. At some point in there in the late 1700s, early 1800s, as they began to write about us, we went from being a society or an organization to a sect, S-E-C-T, which by definition means that's when the church began thinking that we were a religion. And so by the time you get to 1846, we went from being this slight problem to the awfulest thing on earth. And it's just really the intensity and the aggression of these things really changes. The other thing I would say is, if you ever wondered why they told us in the Fellowcraft degree we should learn rhetoric, you got to read these things. These are the most magnificently written documents using all the tools of rhetoric to build a concept, to build an argument, regardless of the facts sometimes, that I've ever seen. And I think that I'm reading the right thing because I got my translation, since I don't read Latin, from the Vatican website. So I'm hoping that they correctly translated their own material, and I'm pretty sure they did. And it's just really well written. I mean, they're just fun fun to read. So we talked about bulls and encyclicals and what's the difference. And this is the only dad joke I'll do. This is not a papal bull. Believe it or not, I got this from a Catholic website. Okay, this is what a bull is. So a bull refers to this lead seal that's on the bottom of this piece of paper, actually probably vellum. And the original word in Latin is bulla, B-U-L-L-A, but it got shortened to bull. So what this is doing is this is giving legitimacy and saying this is the official document from the Pope. So the Pope would write up what his latest things were he wanted to tell people about, and then put this lead seal on it. And they've made lots of these, obviously, and then they got distributed throughout the organization. And that's how they were communicating changes in law and doctrine and so on. Now, somewhere along the way, and I still haven't figured out exactly why, they changed from using bulls to encyclicals, and there's kind of a subtle difference. Papal bulls in the beginning, the best way I can put this is think about you're in an organization, and the CEO writes a memo to the executive staff and says, hey, executive staff, here's the change that we're making in the organization, and I want you to tell all the people below you. So you don't talk directly to the people below you. You talk to your executive staff, you delegate. That makes a lot of sense. Bulls are infallible. They can't be ignored, not supposed to be ignored. And the way these things are written is really kind of interesting because every time somebody writes a new bull or even encyclical on something that someone's already written about, they have to repeat all the stuff that all the guys before them said. So these things get longer and longer and longer and more unwieldy all the time. So they just keep adding. No one ever says, well, okay, that bull that was written 2 years ago, that's out. Here's our new idea. They'll literally repeat the old one and then just add to it. Encyclicals can be thought of like the CEO writes an all company memo, right? So the Pope can send it just to the bishops, or he can send it to everybody, and to be read by everybody and seen by everybody and to be followed. But interestingly enough, it loses its infallibility when it's an encyclical. And while they would like you not to ignore it or reject it, you know, you really can actually get away with it. Now, think about this. You got a worldwide organization. This is just like any other large company. I worked for several multinational companies in my career. And I can tell you, the farther away you get from HQ, from headquarters, sometimes the less you follow the rules to the letter. I guess that would be the way I would put it, because it's like, well, that doesn't work in my area. I have a completely different culture in my business environment. And I think the same thing happens for the church, but it was a good try. Keep in mind for them, the world at that time would have simply been the Mediterranean, Europe, parts of Scandinavia, and a little bit of the British Isles. But still, that's a lot of ground to cover when you don't have the internet. So again, these things are written in a particular form. And the form always starts with establishing the power and authority of the church, and that the church is there to run, so to speak, or to instruct us that are not part of the church. So kind of like they're the teacher, we're the students kind of thing, right? So first they establish all that. Here's how we got our power, and here's what we're supposed to be doing. Then there'll be this list of accusations about Freemasonry, and they're all generally conspiratorial. This is the kind of stuff, some of these, by the time we get to the 1800s, this is the kind of stuff you hear on AM talk radio nowadays during the day. I mean, these are, the conspiracy thing just gets way out of hand. And I have an example of that I'm going to share with you tonight. And then, of course, they say, well, okay, now that we've told you that, what are you supposed to do about it? And how are we going to punish these people? And the punishments were generally pretty rough. It went anywhere from excommunication, which was far more important to people in the 18th and 19th century, maybe, than it is today, because it's hard for us to really appreciate how much, how people felt and how much the church was involved in day-to-day life in these times, as opposed to our times. Even the most penitent of people nowadays, or the most religious of people nowadays, probably don't even hold a candle to how much was going on back then. And this was given out, and the local staff in your office of inquisition are charged with rooting out and destroying Freemasonry. So it wasn't just, please don't do this. If you find it, you need to kill it. And in fact, they did. The Inquisition, if you read a scholarly level book about the Inquisition, it's really pretty gross. the things that they did. And a lot of Freemasons were in fact burned at the stake and tortured and so on and so forth, primarily because it's that whole, you're being heretical, stop it. Well, I don't want to stop it. Well, then, this is what happens. There's a great book out there, and it's in the bibliography in the prose version. It's a reproduction and explanation of the handbook for the Inquisition that tells them how to do all this stuff. And it's fascinating. Or maybe I'm strange. I don't know. Anyhow, so that's where we started. That's how they're all built. So we're going to jump up to 1846, and we're going to leave the 1700s behind because we don't have time for that. But I just wanted to pull out a couple of things to give you a flavor of what's going on here. So Pius IX writes this encyclical about Freemasonry, right? And it expands on what's been going on. And the neat thing to me is by 1846, what he added was that we were in charge of communism and socialism. Now, if you look at what was going on in the world at that particular time, these two concepts were getting a lot of traction. And obviously, they're not good for the church because they take away from the church's power and effect and reach. So obviously, Freemasonry was in charge of those things. And I thought that was really quite interesting, especially since so much of especially Scottish Rite Freemasonry is very patriotic, at least in our country, is very patriotically based and so on. It's like, oh, no, sorry, we're the other direction. And then I pulled out this particular quote because these are the kinds of things that they said that scare me when I read these. And it would have been a scary time to live. So he's talking about Freemasonry being a bad idea. And he makes this comment that as the result of this filthy medley of errors, and that's us, Freemasonry, we're a filthy medley of errors. We've been, in previous ones, we've been called perverts. We've been called all kinds of nasty things. Okay, so as a result of this filthy medley of errors, which creeps in from every side, and as the result of the unbridled license to think, speak, and write, we see the following, and then he goes on to essentially tell us that the church and the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Think about that. We live in America. It's hard for us to imagine anybody that's worried about anyone having the ability to think, speak, and write freely. And that's what the Pope is saying is wrong here. So right away, you can see where we're going to start having problems between Freemasonry and the Roman Church. In fact, by 1846, it seems kind of odd because now we've got the United States is here. We've baked all this stuff into our Constitution and our founding laws. And they're still worried about this idea that people are thinking, speaking, and writing for themselves. They never quite got over the Enlightenment. And that's one of the problems. So he issues this thing in 1846, but things aren't going well. Freemasonry still exists by 1859. So they cook up this document called the Alta Vendita. Now, this is a whole side presentation that's actually in the prose version. It has to do with this organization called the Carbonari, which if you don't remember that from high school history, look it up again. It's fascinating. It essentially was a shadow organization that modeled itself after Freemasonry. And according to the church, it was being run by Freemasonry. And the whole idea of this organization was to take over the church, get rid of the Pope, and get rid of Christianity and all this kind of stuff. And this Alta Vendita, which essentially would be Grand Lodge in Italian for Carbonaries. The Vendita is where you buy carbon, charcoal and the like. They claimed it was written by, this is a pen name, Piccolo Tigre, which is just tiny tiger or small tiger. But that was the pen name of a guy, Giuseppe Mazzini, which you also need to look into on your own time, I guess, or read the long version. Mazzini was very, very involved and important in the bringing together of Italy into one common country. He was also a big supporter of Pius IX, which is odd, but he didn't always get along with the Pope. And interestingly enough, in some of the materials that the church has produced, they actually refer to Mazzini as being a Jew, because of course that would be bad, at least in that part of history, right? And he obviously wasn't. He was very Catholic. We don't know if he was a Mason or not. You can't find him in the rolls of the Grand Lodge of Italy, but then again, they're not all that accurate anyhow, so we don't really know. He was, however, also a big promoter of equal rights for women. And that's something that the church is going to tell us here in a little bit is not a good idea. So they cook up this document and say, oh, look, we found this document by this organization that's run by Freemasonry that says they're going to take over the church. This is their big master plan. And how we're going to do it is we're going to infiltrate over many years the church by, first you get people to be a priest, and then priests become bishops, bishops become archbishops, archbishops become cardinals, so on and so forth. Eventually we'll have a Freemason pope, and then he'll just shut the whole thing down. And they're doing that very patiently. That's what Freemasonry is doing. And they're corrupting the young by educating them. Again, historically, think about where education had been done prior to this. It was always controlled by the church. So the nuns were teaching the women and only the stuff that they thought women should know, which didn't generally include reading and writing and maths and all that sort of stuff. And of course, then the men are teaching the young men. And so now we're starting to see secular education come about, and it's like, that's the Freemasons working against us. And this was really popular. People really bought into this, but unfortunately what happened was eventually it was discovered to be a forgery that was done by the Vatican simply to defame the Freemasons. Now, you might have thought that should have died in the 19th century, because you say, well, once everybody knows it's a forgery, why would you still follow this? It's still going on today. So it's still referred to today in Catholic literature. I now have a very complete collection of anti-Masonic stuff, either written by or approved by the Catholic Church about Freemasonry, and they still refer to this document. And there's this group called Sedevacantists, if I'm pronouncing that right, that think that in fact, this is what's going on, and their proof is the Vatican II conference that was held in 1963 that liberalized a lot of the Catholic practices. So this is a copy of or a picture of the front of the book. You can buy it on Amazon. I've given you a copy in a PDF format because it's available free on the internet in a PDF format of the book. You can read this guy's whole book, and it also contains the original translation for the so-called master plan of invading the church and so on. So this is not 4 or 5 guys in their mom's basement playing World of Warcraft. And this is a very well organized group of adults, very large group of adults, and they know what they're doing. They're well funded, and they're sure that this is actually going on because of the liberality that happened after 1963. So some of this stuff follows us forever and seems to never go away. Okay, we jump to 1884. 1884 gives us Humanum Genus, which was the ultimate anti-Masonic thing ever written by the church, by Leo XIII. Leo XIII was a rather interesting character. I'm going to recommend you find a book called Absolute Monarchs, the story or the history of the papacy, by John Norwich. And it's a fascinating book, and read up on Leo XIII. He was an interesting character. Anyhow, Leo releases this big encyclical. So again, what do? You start with all the stuff that came before it, and then you add a bunch of stuff, right? And this document is the basis of everything that the church is still using today, and not just the Roman Catholic Church, but other Christian bodies that don't approve of Freemasonry are using these same things. I mean, it's just word for word for word. They've got this list of stuff, and they just keep using it. And so this was really big when this came out. So it's a strong document. Here's how Leo starts out. So the Pope starts out by dividing the world into 2 groups. This is a very strong start. One group is those people following the teachings of the Catholic faith. You're going to be saved. Salvation is okay. You're good. You're virtuous. Everything's okay. Everybody else is in the kingdom of Satan, and you're not going to be saved. You're going to burn in hell, and you're not right. You don't have the right truth, right? That's a bold beginning, to just split people down the middle and say, that's it, kids. You're either with us or against us. So I went in and I pulled out a couple of things that I found kind of scary, and I've emphasized them in this particular one. For example, this thing about this first one here where he says, but as the abilities of all are not equal, talks towards our concept of equality being on the level in Freemasonry. And what he's saying here is, well, people don't all have the same abilities, and they don't have all the same powers in mind or body, and therefore it's repugnant to reason to endeavor to confine all within the same measure. In other words, you don't treat all people equally because they have different abilities. and to extend complete equality to the institutions of civil life. Think about what that says. That says that this is like Animal Farm, which probably most of you had to read, depending on your age, in high school. Everybody was equal, but the pigs were more equal than everybody else, right? Same thing going on here is saying, well, since everybody's different, not everybody should have access to everything society has equally. To me, that was frightening. Again, as an American, as somebody born in the 20th century, I find that kind of stuff, just scary to see. Then he goes on and talks about it some more. And he gets down to the second part that I've bolded here, where he talks about, since we're all dissimilar and so on, if we treated everyone equally, then the state will appear most deformed, by which he means that things are going to fall apart and not work. And that's the kind of rhetoric that came at the end here in 1884. It was like, oh, they just put it all in one document and made it as strong and as bold as they possibly could. So one of the things we have to do when looking at any of this stuff is look at the historical context of what else was going on in the world during that time that might have influenced these feelings. Now, this isn't all the great things that happened in the world. I just picked the ones that were biggest and had probably the most effect on this. So we look at the Enlightenment, especially in France. We look at the French Revolution. France was the last country to sign on to the separation of church and state idea. They were uber Catholic until the revolution. And then they went completely the other way, and the country became practically atheistic for quite a few decades. And so, wow, that took a lot of power and income and control out of the church's hand. American Revolution, of course, we started a whole country based on ideas that are primarily thought of as Enlightenment or free or Masonic, right? So that's not good. Then you have what's on the right side here, which is the Risorgimento, if I'm doing my Italian correctly. And what that refers to was the effort to take all the separate kingdoms and republics of the Italian peninsula and put them together to make one country. And in doing so, two things happened. One was the loss of the papal states, which I'm going to show you in a second. And two, and this is where we have to separate causation and correlation, but a great many of the men that were involved in this movement, which caused a great reduction in the reach and power of the church, were Freemasons. Now, correlation is not necessarily causation, unless you're the church, at which point they said, well, if these guys are Freemasons, then that must be what Freemasonry is about. They're trying to kill the church. And you can start to see and appreciate, I think, their side of the story. Look at this map. Prior to the 1800s, you had the papal states, which is some of the best parts of Italy, really. And they're between the two biggest kingdoms, the Republic of Venice and the Kingdom of Sicily. They've got power, they've got land, they've got income. They're running things. And by 1870, once you make a whole country out of it, on the right side of the slide, you're down to a few square miles in Rome called Vatican City. That's got to hurt. It's tough to, if you have a mission statement that says, we have the one and only truth, and our mission in life is to spread that truth and to tell people about it and to help them be saved, help them to reconcile with God, and all of a sudden, that power is taken away from you and you're scrunched into this little tiny place. You need a reason. And as is human for most of us, you look for somebody to point to. And unfortunately, as I said, a lot of the people involved in this project were in fact Freemasons. So, here's where we're at by 1884. The church has just been beat on every side. They had to go through the Renaissance, the Reformation. We have science and philosophy wiping out superstition and blind following of things, right? People are starting to reason on their own. This concept of self-reason and self-determination, which, as we've seen, is obviously an anathema to the church, is just getting out of hand. Of course, the Enlightenment was the really big one that punched a hole in it. And this then touches off the separation of church and state. You have to understand, in 18th century politics and before, and even in 19th century to a certain extent, the church and the state were one. And you got to be king because the church allowed you to be king. And you had to, there was this uneasy war, so to speak, between the king and the church as to who was really running the country and why and so on. And the kings started figuring out, hey, we can just separate the two. I can just ignore the church and do what I want to do, and kind of, tone down some of the other stuff I'm doing. And people like that. So this church and state separation that came about is also attributed to Masons. And of course, you've got Protestants running around all over the place willy-nilly, starting up all these other ideas. That doesn't help. And then you lose a great majority of your income because you've lost the papal states. So I think at this point, it's easy to appreciate why you would be looking for a scapegoat for this, and how you could make the mistake of correlation and causation, because every time you turn over a rock and something bad happens, there always seems to be a Mason at the bottom of it. Now, I don't think that Masonry on the continent necessarily was that way. It may have been in Italy, and we're going to take a look at that to a certain extent, because there are some lodges that were started that in fact really weren't regular as we would call them today, and they really were political organizations just trying to upset the church. So good thing is we didn't sit on our hands. By gosh, we had to respond. One of the more popular things that came out was released in 1752 in French, called A New Year's Gift to the Pope, or The Freemasons Vindicated. We have a copy of the 1882 English version in our library, and someday I'll scan it and send it to you guys. It's really cool. And it's written under a pen name, obviously, Le Chevalier, which is just the Knight, DL. And nobody knows who this was to this day, but he obviously knew a lot about Masonry and a lot about how the church worked. And this got translated and retranslated and printed and reprinted and sent all over the place. And it was one of the first pushbacks that Masonry did as an actual printed effort against all of this enmity that was coming from the church. And then, of course, our good brother Albert Pike had to help us out. Now, if any of you have read Al, and I'm sure most of you have tried reading Morals and Dogma at some point or another, Al has a lot to say. And he says it in a very 19th century way, very flowery, very wordy, very long sentences, and so on. So he got started during the allocution at the 84 Supreme Council. Then he got home and he decided, I got some more to say. There's something else I wanted to talk about. So then he added to it. And then he took a part of this book called Profession of Faith in the 19th Century by Eugene Pelletan and put that in the book and released this book that had this kind of three-part thing: the allocution, the continuation, and the stuff from Pelletan. And he printed the living daylights out of that and put it all over Europe and all over America. And this was his big refutation. Now, it's classic Pike. It's dozens of pages. Oh, by the way, this is available on Amazon as a Kindle book. Not as a printed book, oddly enough, but as a Kindle book. And it's classic Pike. It's dozens of pages and only 3 sentences long. The man never knew when to put a period in. The important thing to look at here, though, is this book by Eugene Pelletan, Profession of Faith. This was a very influential book during this period in the world. In fact, a lot of world leaders pointed to this book as a book that influenced them most about how they were running the politics of their country, including, in our case, Woodrow Wilson. Now, Pike didn't help himself any. This is where we have this issue with it. The Catholic Church doesn't look at different flavors of Freemasonry like we do. So you got, craft Masonry from England, you got the Scottish Rite, mostly French, you got the York Rite from England. It's all one big thing. Depending on your age and when you were brought into the Scottish Rite, you may have done the 30th degree with this particular issue. So this is from the original 30th degree as practiced up to, I believe, the turn of this century is when Kleinknecht or the guy after him rewrote the ritual for the degrees and took some of the stuff out. But in the 30th degree, which talks about tyranny and why it's bad and everything, this is a scan from a book that the Scottish Rite printed for the rituals. Apparently, they could only afford a cartoon, a comic book illustrator, because Philip de Fair looks like he's wearing some superhero outfit, and the Pope just looks confused. And there's some real historical inaccuracies in here. If you want to know, ask me, I'll tell you. But the point being, in the 30th degree at that time, and I remember doing this, there was a point in the ceremony where a representation of the triple tiara, which is what the Pope wears there on his head, that's called the triple tiara, it was made out of cloth, was placed on the floor, and each of the participants came down and you had to stomp on it. And then there was some text that you had to repeat about essentially death to tyrants, that kind of thing. This is not helping our case. And the unfortunate thing about it is Albert Pike was for sure very anti-papist, and you could also say anti-Catholic church. He wrote a lot of bad stuff. And the New Age magazine, which was the original name for the journal that the Scottish Rite printed, up through into the 60s, and didn't really stop till around the 70s, was more often than not filled with articles that were anti-Catholic, especially the concept of public schools versus parochial schools. So we kind of dug our own grave on this one, at least. And that's still kind of the issue, is it's trying to get away from these sorts of things. Now, again, what did Pike put in the front of his book? Right? In front of Morals and Dogma, if you read the preface, it says the exact same thing I said. You can believe or reject any of this. It's just my opinion. But of course, the church likes to say, oh, he's the expert. One of the things that confuses anti-Masons and everybody, and including some Masons, is there is no one voice that speaks for Masonry. That screws people up because they say, well, he published a book, so he must be an expert. No, he's a good writer and he's got some good ideas, but we don't have to follow him. And they don't get that concept. They think since Albert Pike put this stuff out, that everybody buys it 100%. Oh, I threw this in there just because I think this is the greatest picture ever. This is Eugene Pelton, who wrote this book. Check that guy out. That's a guy that's looking to cause trouble. I don't care what you say. you look at them eyebrows and that look, and it's like, yeah, there's a guy that's looking to upset a few apple carts. So I don't know. I just got a kick out of him. So we're down to the end of the the end of the 19th century. And so what I did is I went in and I pulled out everything that was specific in these bulls and encyclicals as to what our errors are. And this is the list I came up with. And it's really quite amazing, because we appear to be atheists, Unitarians, naturalists, pantheistic, and deists all at the same time. And as we know from listening to Brother Terry a couple of weeks ago, there's no way we could be deists because we pray at our meetings. So that one's out. We can't be an atheist and still be some other religion, because that's kind of the point of being an atheist, right? There may actually be a connection between the concepts of universalism and Unitarianism and Freemasonry. And Quattro Coronati Lodge has been doing some research on that, and I'm hoping they come up with some stuff pretty soon. Then, of course, as I said, as we got closer to our time, we became communists and socialists. And then, of course, if all else fails, blame the Jews. So Freemasonry is also just a front for the Jews to destroy the church. Going on, turns out Freemasonry runs all secret societies. Again, historically, during this period of time, there were a lot of so-called secret societies, right? Fraternal organizations and so on. And regardless of what their point was or what their theories were or what they said their tenets were, it's all actually being run by Freemasonry. Freemasons are corrupting youth, and especially women, by educating them. And then this next one is a killer. I don't know if any of you have read much Voltaire, but Voltaire was quite the stick in the eye for the church during his life. And yes, he was a Freemason. So they think, oh, well, he cooked up Freemasonry, or maybe he just got into it and corrupted it. The reality is Voltaire didn't become a Mason until about 6 months before the end of his life. Now, they didn't know it was 6 months before the end of his life, obviously, but that's how short it was. Ben Franklin was actually his guide through the ritual. And Voltaire had written about as much stuff negative about Freemasonry as he had about the Roman Church. So why they thought Voltaire had anything to do with this is still a mystery to me, but it shows up a lot. We caused, in fact, ran the French Revolution, because France was the big one they lost, and that really hurt. In fact, anytime there's a revolution or a leadership change that weakens the church, it's probably being run by Freemasons. And of course, by this time, even though we know it's a forgery by this time, they're still pushing the Alta Vendita document and saying that, yeah, this is the problem. And this stems from these incorrect beliefs that we have. And if you read this, it's kind of like a recruiting poster to a certain extent, either for living in America or being a Freemason. So self-reason, equality, religious tolerance is the big one. And that makes sense. And again, not judging, but just saying, compare. If you start with a mission statement, or if you start with foundational statements that say we're the one and only church and we're the only ones that know what we're doing, then yes, if you find an organization that accepts other religious practices, you're going to say that doesn't go with us, so that's wrong. The separation of church and state. This last one I couldn't figure out, and I still haven't figured out. But there, in one of the, I think in the last one in the 1700s, there's this long diatribe about how Freemasonry is supporting divorce. I've never seen that unless there's some rituals I don't know about, which could very well be, that are no longer used, that were only used in, I don't know, somewhere on the continent. And that we're trying to make marriage a civil union only and get the church out of marriages. I have never seen either one of those things involved in any of the historical stuff that I've read. And primarily I've looked at, English documents. So I don't know what was going on in France and Italy, but that one's kind of weird. And then of course, the obligations are a huge problem for them. So that leaves us at the end of part one. And that's about as fast as I can do that, guys. But that's how we got up to here. Now, next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at part two and we're going to say, well, that's nice. That was history, Tom. Yeah, it was, but it's still following us. What about during my lifetime? And most of us were on here, obviously, were born, in fact, all of us had to have been born either in the 20th century or the 21st century. I don't think we have any 19th century men with us tonight. That'd be kind of cool if we did. And so, what about during, modern times, my times, what's going on? And that's what we're going to cover next week. So here we are at this juncture almost from the word go. The church had a problem with us. I think you can see why some of these things might be due to some of the fundamental principles that they're saying, support their rationality for their organization. They've tried various things. Yes, we have been persecuted. Yes, there were people killed during the Inquisition. By the way, the Inquisition never ended. We're going to cover that next week as well. So that's how we got at least up to the 20th century. And so I'm going to quit sharing my screen and we'll see if we have any questions or comments or discussions.
Thank you, Most Worshipful Brother Thomas. Brothers, please unmute yourself and ask questions if you have them.
Wow, the crickets.
Everyone's just still sitting back processing, I think.
Well, Tom, this was a phenomenal kind of a whirlwind through a pretty complex topic. It's outstanding. I downloaded already the presentation because I'm going to kind of go through this. This was very well done. There's one book I do want to share, or at least kind of an outline or touch on here, and that is a book by John Hickey called The Craft. Mm-hmm. He does an outstanding job just kind of explaining the history of the craft, but in particularly hones into the topic that you addressed this evening, and that is Freemasonry and the Catholic Church. So it's an easy read, it's a light digest, or kind of so I would definitely recommend everybody.
Well, and it's thank you for that. And I want to also remind people a couple of weeks ago when Most Worshipful Terry was speaking, he recommended the book. Hang on, I got it over here and now I can't say the title. Workman Unashamed. Mm-hmm. And it's a great book for two reasons. One, you get a very good look into how British Freemasonry works. It's a very British book. And two, this is by a guy who had the same crisis of conscience, I guess you would say, about being a Christian and being Freemasonry, and worked his way through it. And he explains how he's come to task with these things. And it's not a difficult read. I found it quite interesting, and I would really recommend it. As you can see, this is so much stuff came up when I was doing this. I started this. The first version of this was in 2017. I'm still adding things. I'm still adding documents. I'm still adding all kinds of things that I find. It's like, oh, that's a little weird thing where somebody got involved and did something. And as I said, we're not clean. Occasionally, Freemasonry some people has done some dumb stuff, and I don't blame the church at all for being insulted, upset, whatever by some of those things. But in general, no. In general, they willingly seem to not want to look at the facts.
Say, Tom, the whole concept of infallibility, I gave a while ago a presentation on this very same channel here. No, actually on the Scottish Rite channel about where do the rumors and misconceptions in around Freemasonry come from. And through my research, I found that it was basically Pius IX who introduced the whole concept of infallibility, but it was not a concept before. I mean, they
Right.
claimed the right to it, but was not officialized, let's say, until Pius IX. Is that correct?
Yes, it wasn't until the late 1800s, I think around 1869, if I look back at the slides, I can tell you. But yeah, it was quite late in church history that he became infallible. And the thing that's interesting about this is he's only infallible when speaking on matters of doctrine.
Right.
So you can still play bridge with him and that kind of stuff, and he doesn't get to always win. He's not infallible on just everything. That's a boiled egg. Well, no, it isn't, sir. And no, it's only when he's speaking. So it's a very narrow bit of infallibility, but it's a very important piece of infallibility. Now, the interesting thing to me about this, as I was reading through this too, was back to this idea about, does everybody pay attention when the Pope speaks? And if you've ever been in charge of a group of people, guess what that answer is, right? It's no. And in particular, the Scandinavian countries seem to have a real talent for ignoring things that the Pope puts out as official documents as a bull or an encyclical. They pretty much go, and the Swedes just keep doing whatever the Swedes and the Danes and so on want to do, which I find fascinating, because Masonry in Sweden, for example, is purely Christian. They don't have the same universality concept that we would in this country. And yet the Pope says, well, you can't be. And one of the things, I'll give you a little preview here, it's a teaser. One of the things that happened and still happens, especially in Scandinavia, was quite a few priests, members, familiars, employees of the Roman Church, as it were, joined Freemasonry. And it became so bad that there's actually laws. They had to actually cook up laws specifically about that. And we're going to look at those next month. So that tells me that not everybody was buying what was going on. And again, you're trying to run this worldwide organization. How can you get everybody to agree? I mean, we can't agree in our own lodges. So, it's not that unusual.
Anybody got another question?
One of the questions I had, well, first, I echo Hans's comments. This was outstanding, and it's a subject that I'm very interested in and looking to study more. You referenced a number of documents, books, and things. And so I was trying to take some notes, but there are several of them. There was multiple things there that I wanted to follow up. And is there a way to get like a list of some of those key books that we should be seeing, or key?
As a matter of fact, there is. So if you go to the link that's still in the
chat
I
downloaded the documents from the Dropbox already. So
excellent. Okay, so on the very last page of the pros presentation is all the internet links and the books that I used.
I hadn't.
And the thing is, to do this correctly, what has to happen, and I found this interesting because I'm kind of a history nut, not everybody will. You have to go back. I had to anyhow, because I didn't have a great education. All right. I was educated in a public school. So I certainly didn't have a liberal education. I know that much. You have to go back and read some decent books about the Enlightenment and the Reformation and the structure of the church. I mean, you have to really know your European history between the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to get why some of this stuff was as important as it was, both to the church and to Freemasons, and why Freemasonry was such a revolutionary and dangerous thing. Freemasonry promotes these incredibly dangerous ideas if you're trying to run an autocratic organization. So if you're trying to be a king or you're trying to be a pope, the last thing you need are people that say, hey, let's treat everybody equal and give everybody a voice and everybody gets a vote. And we can all think for ourselves, and hey, there's no experts. You can all interpret this however you want. That's not how you keep a people under control.
Again, this was outstanding, and I'm looking forward to next week. So
good, thank you.
Yeah, by the way, the reason why Voltaire was kind of a link to Freemasonry or viewed as a kind of an evil Freemason was because his principal teaching and philosophies were very narrowly overlapping, or largely overlapping, I should say, with Freemasonry. And so the church took kind of the liberty to put that all in one bucket, or certainly
yes.
after he, towards the end of his life, became a Freemason. And that was really the thing that sealed the deal, right?
Yeah, and you know, Hans, you bring up a very good point. One of the things that you do, and again, I can't interview any of the people that did this, so I don't know if it was purposeful or by accident, but I'm pretty sure it was purposeful. When you're using rhetoric, true point, if you're using true rhetoric, you don't always stick to the facts, but if you do, you have to have this one little tiny piece of fact, and then you build something around it. If you think about it, our ritual is that way. We all know that if you read the Bible, Hiram went home. He didn't die. He didn't get buried. He didn't get raised up again. He didn't do any of the stuff in our ritual. But there was a guy called Hiram, and he did have something to do with Solomon's temple. Although he didn't show up and build it, he showed up after it built, if you actually read the Bible. But we ignore it because it was common in the 18th and 19th century to write that way, because you couldn't always write things literally, which that's not maybe a good way. You know, you couldn't just like put it right out there and say, here's what it is. You had to kind of hide some of your deeper thoughts. And it was very common to take a piece of reality and then build a legend around it in order to teach a lesson, which is what our ritual does. Well, the church does that too. Everybody, all Freemasons are the same everywhere. One of the things we'll examine next week is that's one of the mistakes that's being made, is Freemasonry on the continent is different than Freemasonry in America. It just is. And if you've ever been there and gone to it, you'll find out it's weird, because it's not what you're used to. I mean, I've been to a lot of different jurisdictions in this country, and it pretty much, you know, we all use different words, but we're all doing the same thing, right? Not so once you leave this country and you get over to Europe. It starts getting very, very different. So, and I didn't even cover, one of the things I didn't cover, the Leo Taxiel hoax, which is in itself an entire presentation. And you really need to look at that, because that is so cool. And they're still pushing that, by the way, even though he admitted it was a joke. I didn't cover the P2 scandal back in the 80s with that lodge in Italy that was running the finances of the Vatican, but turned out to be, they really were an evil lodge. So,
by the way, the Leo Taxiel hoax is available on the Scottish Rite archive webinars. I did that probably a month or two ago.
Yeah, there's several volumes of Heraldom have had different coverages of it, and I went and got some of his stuff, and I didn't realize there was this woman having visions and so on and so forth that never existed. And you know, I knew he had been writing the stupid stuff, but it's like, holy crap. He really spun a tail, and it went on for so long. It went on for like a decade.
It was the most brilliant design. I mean, it was just, yeah. Watch that presentation. It's really a fun one.
Let's see, Reed. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, what has happened? Be careful, because what has happened is, since I've shared this at Grand Lodge and a bunch of lodges, I get a lot of calls from people that are having problems either with their local parish. See, I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in Lincoln, Nebraska, we had a bishop a few years ago that decided it was the 18th century, and he excommunicated everybody that was a Mason or any of the Masonic bodies. So Eastern Star, Job's Daughters, the whole 9 yards. And that still holds true today, even though he retired. The guy that took his place is still enforcing that. And it's kind of weird, because only in Lincoln. Now, out in Grand Island, which is a town about an hour and a half away from here to the west, where things get really large, we did a cornerstone one year when I was in Grand Lodge line for a Catholic hospital that was being built. And it says on the cornerstone, laid by the Freemasons of Nebraska and the Knights of Columbus. And there was no problem whatsoever. The priests were there, the nuns were there, everybody was there from the church. They didn't care. They just thought it was a great day. We're opening this new hospital. We got a cornerstone laid. They said, oh, that's a really great ceremony. Thank you. They didn't mind that we had prayer and stuff. But if you're in Lincoln, you have to be careful. It's a really hot topic. And so what will happen is, or what has happened, and again, Reed, be ready. Once people know you have some information about this, you start getting calls. So far, depending on how you look at it, I'm either 3-0 or I'm 0-3. in as much as I've had 3 official arguments with church elders, not all of them Catholic. Nobody changed their mind, but by the same token, they stopped the conversation because they ran out of things to complain about, because I kept pulling out documents and going, here, look at this, here, look at this, here, look at this. And it's like, ah, and it really ticks them off when they start trying to quote the Bible to you, and then you pull quote back and say, well, no, what it says here is, see right here, it practically describes Freemasonry. It's like, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, well, you know. So it's kind of an interesting cat and mouse game. But like I say, so far, no one's seen the light. So I guess I failed, but it's fun.
Well, it all depends on what your goal was in the beginning, right? So
yeah, just you never know when you plant a seed, and which is biblical too. And you know, maybe somewhere down the line it starts to make sense to them or something. So and it keeps me on my toes. So far, nobody's come and tried to burn me at the stake or anything, or you know, pull my toenails out. So I think I'm
small mercies.
small
mercies. Yes, exactly. Small mercies. So
I've had a similar experience with that, in that I've had a number of people have come to me over the years in my role, and they're Catholic, and they're struggling with the faith in the Catholic Church. And I've always taken the position of ask them to just articulate what it is it that about Masonry that gives you pause. And I quietly respond and give them answers. And I had the same response you did, is eventually they give up because they can no longer refute it. They can't.
Right.
They can't find arguments to actually.
Yeah, all their information has come from the other side, and they've managed to twist the picture to make it look the way they want it to. And it's like, well, no, we don't believe that. You know, this thing about, well, you don't believe in Christ because you don't say his name in lodge. Well, no, because we're trying to be polite. We believe that everybody gets a chance to have their own religion. That's one of the major sticking points. And I'm surprised at how many, not just the Catholic Church, but how many other Christian denominations have a problem with that. That's just amazing to me. I don't read that. When I read my Bible, I don't get that out of that it ought to be that way. But that's just my opinion.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, Most Worshipful, for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And we will be on to part 2 next week. So thank you, everyone, for joining.